When free grace awoke me by light from on high, then legal fear shook me. I trembled to die. No refuge, no safety in self could I see. Jehovah Tzidkenu, my Savior, must be. My terrors all vanished before the sweet name. My guilty fears banished. With boldness I came to drink at the fountain, life-giving and free. Jehovah Tzidkenu is all things to me.
That was John Piper reading an autobiographical poem by Robert Murray McCheyne. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper begins a 3-part series titled The Supreme Joy of Robert Murray McCheyne. This talk was originally given at the Desiring God 2011 Conference for Pastors.
It's amazing to me how God has raised up extraordinary young people and then cut them off in their youth and then preserved their impact with a book for decades and centuries to come. For example, Jim Elliot was 28 years old when he was cut off in the jungle of Ecuador, and nobody today would know who he was except for Through Gates of Splendor and The Shadow of the Almighty, written 2 years after he died by his wife. Or another example, David Brainerd, missionary to the American Indians in the 1740s, cut off at the age 29 in 1747, and nobody would have a clue who David Brainerd was, except that 2 years later, Jonathan Edwards wrote a book about him and included some of his journals in it, so that today the life of David Brainerd is among the 3 most influential books in the history of modern missions. Another example, Henry Martyn, missionary to India and Persia, died in 1812, cut off at the age of 31. Nobody would have known, maybe you don't even know who Henry Martyn was, except that John Sargent, 4 years later, a good friend, wrote the memoir of Reverend Henry Martyn, B.D. And so generations of students, especially British students, have been inspired by this young man's life. I find that to be an amazing pattern. Raise up a man full of the Holy Spirit with an extraordinary power on his life and cut him off at age 30 and then preserve his life in a book. It's an interesting way that God does things. So we're focusing on one of them, namely Robert Murray McCheyne, not a missionary this time, but a local pastor in Dundee, Scotland, who died in 1843 at the age of 29. And perhaps of all those young saints, the least likely to be remembered because of how unextraordinary his life was. He wasn't crucified like Jesus at age 33. He wasn't speared to death like Jim Elliot. He wasn't ravaged in the jungles of early America. And he didn't die 3,000 miles away from his fiancée in Turkey like Martin. He just went to school till he was 22, worked as an associate pastor for a year, became a preacher in a church for 6 years, and he died. And here we are, 168 years later, 1,600 people ready to be inspired by this man because Andrew Bonar, a very, very precious friend, wrote it down, captured his memoir journals, and then added a few sermons and poems, and it's never gone out of print. And everything else we know comes from those, pretty much. So how did it happen? Well, there's always these two things, right? A powerful life and somebody to capture it. McCheyne, Eliot, Brainerd, Martin, Jesus. So what was it about this short life, really short ministry, that causes us to go back to him again and again? What created the force? Because it is a force. Nobody keeps reading a story of a life, no matter how excellently the biography is written, if there's no force in the life, if there's not something extraordinary that affects you when you read it. So I have tried in all my reading to choose a title, which I just thought up a few days ago, so it wasn't pre-published, but you saw it on the screen maybe. I have tried to come up with a title that I think gets at the keys to his life. The title is this: He kissed the rose and felt the thorn, living and dying in the morning of life. Robert Murray McCheyne. Now, the first part of that title, He kissed the rose and felt the thorn, I didn't make up. McCheyne described his teenage years with these words, only I took his words and turned them on their head, because not long after he described himself this way or was this way, God turned him on his head. So let me give you the words that he wrote, and then you'll see the change that I made in them. When he was a teenager, careless, worldly, unconverted, at the university, went to university when he was 14, University of Edinburgh, he said, I kissed the rose, nor thought about the thorn. I kissed the rose, nor thought about the thorn. And I'm turning that upside down because that's what happened to his life. What he meant by that was, I indulged in the amusing and beautiful pleasures of this world. I kissed the rose and didn't give a thought to sickness and suffering and death. That's the thorn. And I'm saying, now he kissed the rose and felt the thorn, and I mean something very different by the rose. Because later, if you do, one of the little parentheses here, one of the great things about Kindle, or whatever you may use, is that you now can download these old books and search them. This is incredible. You can search Rose, and you can get the book free. So, and you don't have to own a Kindle. Just do it on your Mac or your PC, because you can download Kindle for Mac or whatever. So, close that parenthesis. This is how I know this. He often, in his sermons, referred to his precious rose of Sharon. And Jesus became to him a new kind of rose. Once the rose was classical learning, and now the rose is Jesus. And he kissed the rose in a new sense. And instead of, nor did he give any thought to the thorn, now he lived with the thorn stuck in his lungs from the day he was 18 years old, because he had tuberculosis. And he began to realize, I will not be long for this world. And he wasn't. And those two things, the preciousness of Jesus and the shortness of life or the imminency of eternity, I'm arguing, are very close to the root of everything that makes us find him extraordinary. He wrote, set not your heart on the flowers of this world, for they have all a canker in them. Prize the rose of Sharon more than all, for he changeth not. Live nearer to Christ than to the saints, so that when they are taken from you, you may have him to lean on still. So the meaning of my title, He Kissed the Rose and Felt the Thorn, is that there was a double-sided key to his life, namely the preciousness of Christ and the painfulness and shortness of his life. And the point of the subtitle, Living and Dying in the Morning of Life, is simply to underline that second point, that he never made it to noon in the ordinary sense of a life. And more he knew that would be the case, and therefore more and more he lived on the edge of eternity. And when you walk on the edge of eternity, whether you have a disease or whether God just grants you the grace to be aware of it regularly, there is a flavor about your life that I think is what these last three messages you've been listening to have been talking about. So that's the double key I'm going to argue for. McCheyne was born in Edinburgh in May 21, 1813. His parents would have been called moderates in the Scottish Church of Scotland, not evangelical. The moderates were those folks who magnified morality and reason and preached non-exegetical, moralistic, gospel-eviscerated sermons that was killing the Church of Scotland. And that's the household in which he grew up, and therefore he grew up moral, but not born again, because born again wasn't part of what was talked about or believed in with any conviction. He called himself in those days looking back, devoid of God. So he went off to the university at age 14 and he studied classics. The professor of moral theology who came the year after he was there was Thomas Chalmers, who would later become McCheyne's primary influence theologically and mentor during his divinity school days. He was, in those days, from 14 to 18, kissing the rose of classical learning, and he was ignoring the thorn of suffering and death. And he did that ignoring until God forbade him to ignore it in 1831. What happened in 1831, which he described as decisive, at least one of the two decisive things to bring him awake, was the death of his brother David. He had there were four in the family. His sister Isabella died before he was born at 4 months old. He had a sister, Elizabeth, who later became his partner in ministry in that she kept the home for him. He never married, so she kept the manse up. And then he had these two brothers, David and William. And in the summer of 1831, the eldest, namely David, became mortally depressed. He had not walked with God, and now he was dying. And God broke in on David's life, and suddenly, in June and July, saved him. And then he died. And McCheyne watched his brother suffer, be saved, be radiant and full of hope, and then die. And Bonar described David's experience like this: joy from the face of a fully reconciled Father above lighted up his dying face. So McCheyne was looking down on his favorite and loved brother as his face lighted up with forgiveness and justification and eternity, and then die. So the thorn pierced his heart, and stayed lodged there the rest of his life. The thorn pierced him awake. Every year for the rest of his short life, that would be 12 more years, he remembered and marked the anniversary of David's death. The 1-year anniversary. On this morning last year came the first overwhelming blow to my worldliness. How blessed to me, thou, O God, only knowest, who hast made it so. 11 years later, the one just before he died, on the anniversary of David's death, this day, 11 years ago, I lost my loved and loving brother and began to seek a brother who cannot die. His word, began to seek a brother, is important. God saves people in different ways. It wasn't until March of 1832, that is, what's that, about 8 months later, that McCheyne was born again. At least that's the way he perceived it. He was reading the book, The Sum of Saving Knowledge. And he said later, this is the work which I think, first of all, wrought a saving change in me. So the stunning, stabbing, awakening moment to reality and eternity and fragility and sin was the death of his brother with a radiant face of hope. And then 8 months later, reading a book on Reformed doctrine, God saves him decisively. I think that combination is remarkable and says a lot about McCheyne and his heart and mind. What was being converted by God was a poetic lover of the classics. Got to get this now. It's 1831, and he's almost done with his university training, and he loves the classics. He was reading Greek and studying the poets, and he was writing poetry, and this is what he lived for, and he was stabbed, brought awake to another reality by the death of his brother. In other words, an emotionally heart-wrenching moment enters into his life, and then 8 months later, doctrine lands on him, and so you get this highly charged emotional thing, and then arriving later, this weighty catechetical book called The Sum of Saving Knowledge, and together they save him. A poet got saved. And it's not surprising then to me that the story, if you're looking for a testimony in McCheyne, tell me about your conversion. You know where you find it? You find it in a poem called Jehovah Tzidkenu, which I'll read to you in just a moment. But I'm stressing this because I think there are keys to his effectiveness in the fact that he had gotten a classical learning and that he was writing poetry and that the rose he fell in love with did not cancel out his love affair with poetry. I don't think McCheyne was a great poet. In fact, I don't think he was a good poet. But what was good and even great was that he saw the world with a poet's eyes. That is, he was moved by what he saw in the world, and he struggled for language to help others be moved by what he saw in the world. That's what poetry is to me. A poet is a person who looks around and they just see the world differently. They see the Bible differently. They see trees differently. They see wives differently. They see fence posts differently. And they're moved. They're moved by a stump on a road of a tree that fell 300 years ago, and just things happening here when they see the stump. That's a poet. And then they turn to paper and they try to find some language to recapture for others what they felt when they saw the stump. That's what poets do. Or better, the cross, or heaven, or hell, So I don't think he was a great poet. I don't even think he was a very good poet. But my, oh my, did he have eyes. And he had words. Poems, try this, are scattered through the memoir for about 20 or 30 pages. And then they're gone. So you think, he quit all that. He just gave all that up. No, he became a preacher. And then you read his sermons and ask, why is it that almost everybody in this room could give you a quote from McCheyne? Why? And I'll come back to that later. He didn't abandon poetry. He simply applied that poet's heart, that seeing eye, and that groping for language that just might help somebody be stabbed broad awake to this reality that I feel so deeply. That all went into sermons now. And he didn't write much later. You're struck over and over again in these sermons as to how awakening and pleasing and powerful is the language that he finds to describe ultimate realities. He is endlessly quotable. He didn't bury his poetic gift when he was saved. The lover of the classics became the lover of a different rose, the rose of Sharon, and he became grounded in Reformed doctrine. So he's a doctrine-laden, emotionally charged poet. So, he wrote this poem called Jehovah Tzidkenu. That phrase is the last phrase. It's a Hebrew transliteration of the last phrase of Jeremiah 23:6, which says, "And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord, our righteousness." Yahweh Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. And then he wrote this poem and told his story that way. So the closest I can help you hearing his conversion story in his own language is to read this for you. And I think it is one of his better ones. I don't want you to hear this and say, "Oh, Piper thinks it's a bad poem." It's just not a great poem. It's the kind you would write. And you should try, and your wife will appreciate it. Maybe even your church, I don't know. I once was a stranger to grace and to God. I knew not my danger and felt not my load. Though friends spoke in rapture of Christ on the tree, Jehovah Tzidkenu was nothing to me. I oft read with pleasure to soothe or engage Isaiah's wild measure and John's simple page, but e'en when they pictured the blood-sprinkled tree, Jehovah Tzidkenu seemed nothing to me. Like tears from the daughters of Zion that roll, I wept when the waters went over his soul, yet thought not that my sins had nailed to the tree, Jehovah Tzidkenu. 'Twas nothing to me. When free grace awoke me by light from on high, then legal fear shook me. I trembled to die. No refuge, no safety in self could I see. Jehovah Tzidkenu, my Savior, must be. My terrors all vanished before the sweet name. My guilty fears banished. With boldness I came to drink at the fountain, life-giving and free. Jehovah Tzidkenu is all things to me. Jehovah Tzidkenu, my treasure and boast. Jehovah Tzidkenu, I ne'er can be lost. In thee I shall conquer by flood and by field, my cable, my anchor, my breastplate, my shield. Even treading the valley, I'll pause here. This last verse is totally prophetic. And I noticed in one edition that the word fever was replaced by journey. And I thought, who did that? Somebody trying to improve poetry. Never change poetry. Okay, sorry about that. That includes hymns. Okay, it's not nice to the authors. But sorry about that. That wasn't in the manuscript. Even treading the valley, the shadow of death, this watchword shall rally my faltering breath. For while from life's fever, my God sets me free, Jehovah Tzidkenu, my death song shall be. And he died of typhus fever. He had tuberculosis, but he got this typhus probably visiting the sick.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our three-part series on Robert Murray McCheyne with a message titled, The Formative Education of McCheyne. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.